Hi, and welcome to my personal budgeting series. This is part 1, Introduction. I want to begin with an overview of what's going to be included in the personal budgeting series. After the introduction, next comes expense recording and tracking, which will be followed by how to build a budget, how to use a budget, how to create and use a forecast, how to create and use a financial plan, and financial plan scenarios. There is no timetable or schedule yet for when each of these parts will be available. Their availability will be announced through my newsletter that's on retirementjourneys.com. And as far as the objectives for this series, I want to clearly define and differentiate key components of personal budgeting and to show how to develop these components, to describe how to use a budget, a forecast, and a financial plan, and to share some of the tools that I use. Terminology that will appear throughout the budgeting series. Actuals. Those are expenses for which you actually have some record of. For example, a receipt for a meal out, a utility bill, things of that nature. And targets are estimates for not only your expenses, but also for your sources of income. Variance analysis refers to the process of looking at your estimates for a category and comparing it with the actual incurrence of either an expense or income and understanding why there's a difference. Tracking is simply the recording of expenses over a 12-month period. Discretionary versus non-discretionary expenses. Discretionary are those expenses over which you have control over, or we should say more control over, such as going out to eat, going to a sporting event, going to the movies, travel. Those are some examples of discretionary expenses. Whereas non-discretionary expenses are those things which keep a roof over your head, such as rent or mortgage, taxes, utility bills, things of that nature. A budget simply is a process of planning your estimates and matching them up with your actuals and doing that variance analysis. A forecast is when you have changes in your planning assumptions with respect to your budget. You can then go in within that 12-month planning horizon and update your budget basically, and what results is a forecast, which is the appending of new information for your budget to the actual expenses you've been incurring. That'll become more clear as we go through the series. Now, a financial plan differs from a budget primarily in a couple of ways. First is it is a plan that has a longer time frame, whereas a budget is typically 12 months. A financial plan can go for years and years and years, and it often is done with a higher level of detail so that you make more assumptions. You have to kind of be able to estimate things that are going to occur way off in the future. And a scenario is simply the modification of some of the key assumptions that go into the financial plan, and you look at how these different scenarios yield different results. Now, part 2, briefly. Expense recording and tracking. I consider this the essential starting point in the personal budgeting series. It's where you capture and record your actuals. As I said earlier, data is readily available through receipts, statements such as credit cards, and online and mobile payment records. You keep a record of actuals over the 12-month budget time frame. That's critical. And to show how to record expenses using an Excel spreadsheet. So I will show the way that I actually keep track of my expenses using a very simple Excel spreadsheet that will be downloadable. In part 3, how to build a budget. A planning process where you create and assign targets for revenue and expenses to time intervals, such as months or quarters. I typically like to use months, but the key here is it's actually a planning process. It forces you to think as to what you're going to be doing in the next year and assign numbers to those activities. And of course, it includes both your discretionary and non-discretionary expense items. And to show how to create a budget using an Excel spreadsheet. In part 4, how to use a budget, we'll do some variance analysis, look at managing and controlling personal finances, how to use a budget for decision making, and how your budget fits into next year's budget planning cycle. Part 5, how to create and use a forecast. Here we'll use an Excel spreadsheet to demonstrate how to build a forecast. and show how forecasting is used to augment and extend budgeting. Part 6, how to create and use a financial plan. I refer to this as an LRP, long range plan. And the time frame, sometimes it's 3 years, 5 years, sometimes it's for many, many more years. And I'll use an example of an LRP tool. We basically use a proprietary planning tool from Fidelity. We'll cover expense and income data and how we have to sometimes aggregate or make assumptions about these sources of expenses and income, which is less detailed or less precise than what you might find in your annual budget, just because the time frame is pushed so far out into the future. And also, data input may also include assets and other resources, so that we're essentially trying to come up with a cash flow. It's the same principle that businesses or individuals follow with respect to their budgeting process, where you're looking to see whether you're running a surplus or a deficit. And in terms of the LRP, I like to think of this as basically a cash flow analysis. And finally, part 7, financial plan scenarios. And this is a means to factor in or out potential changes that could impact long-term planning, such as reductions in income, market performance, increases in expenses, and it facilitates contingency and worst-case planning. And that's way out there in the future a little bit, so we'll have time to absorb a lot more in advance of that. So you can send your questions or comments via the comment form on retirementjuniors.com. And I want to thank you so much for watching and hope you tune in to part 2.